Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on ISO 27001 certification. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I really appreciate the time you have taken today to attend this webinar on ISO 27001. A few housekeeping items as we go through our webinar today. Our webinar is expected to run about 30 minutes, and we should have some time for questions after our webinar. As we go through the webinar, please feel free to put any questions that you may have in the questions window. And if you're having any difficulty hearing me or seeing the slides, please put them in the chat window, and our moderators will ensure that they are monitoring for any issues. A copy of these slides, as well as this recording, will be sent to everybody early next week. You can also visit us on our website at www.controlcase.com to listen to this webinar or any of the other webinars we have done on many other certification and compliance standards online at www.controlcase.com. As I said, we have about 30 minutes allocated today. So please feel free to put your questions in the questions window. If we are unable to get to your question, we will make sure to reach back out to you with responses to the questions that we were not able to get to that you may have put in the questions window. Once again, thank you for attending the webinar, and let's get started. Our agenda today is to talk about the 27001 standard. We'll talk about some of the other related numbers such as 27002, 27017 that you may have heard. We'll talk a little bit about the actual certification process. We'll talk about the controls that are part of the ISO 27001 framework. We'll talk about kind of the frequency in which you need to be able to do certifications and some of the common challenges that our customers see in the certification and compliance process. But first, let's talk a little bit about ControlCase. So we at ControlCase focus on IT certification and related continuous compliance services. That's all we do, and we have done that for more than 1,000 customers globally in terms of either certifying them to some standard, helping them be continuous compliance to other standards, and in many cases to multiple standards. We at ControlCase really pride ourselves in following a partnership approach with our customers versus a checklist auditor approach. So we are not a checklist auditor. We are your partner, helping you improve your information security program, and then from our side, also evaluating in an appropriate manner your information security program and giving the appropriate certifications that you may have signed up with us for. Also, we pride ourselves on our technology, which is our ControlCase Compliance Hub, which helps streamline and automate the compliance process to ISO 27001, as well as other standards. In addition, we have used our technology as well as our partnership approach to make certification and compliance a continuous process versus a point in time. We are going to talk today about ISO 27001, but here at ControlCase, we can certify companies or get them compliant to multiple standards. Some of these are certifications, some of these are just regulations, some of these are standards that we can assess against and issue a report, and so forth. A very popular offering for our customers is the one audit offering, and that is assess once, certify to many, or comply to many. And that's enabled through a dashboard such as this. So if you are going for ISO certification, you automatically know where you stand against other regulations. And as you can see, here's a dashboard of ISO as well as multiple other regulations, including showing you where we are in the compliance process. So that was a little bit about ControlCase. Now let's get into actually the 27001 standard. So what is ISO 27001? 27001 is a part of the 27,000 family of standards, and it focuses on information security. It's really a framework that provides the requirements for an information security management system. And so again, ISO 27001 is a standard published by the International Organization for Standardization, and it's a global standard. You may have heard of ISO 27002, and so I will spend a few minutes here. We talked about 27001 being a standard and a framework, and so companies can be certified against the ISO 27001 standard. 27002 are the actual controls that focuses on the information security aspects of an organization, some of which the organizations may choose to implement. So 27002 are the actual information security controls, such as strong passwords, enabled logging, physical security, and so forth. And ISO 27002 is not the certification. ISO 27001 is the certification. ISO 27002 are the security controls that accompany the 27001 standard. And so together they form a package, but you're getting certified to the ISO 27001 standard. Now, you might have heard of 27701, 27017, and 27018. So I'll shed a little bit of light on that. 27701 is a privacy extension to the 27001 standard. In the last few years, I would say even the last 5 or 6 years, privacy has and continues to gain increasing scrutiny, whether it's GDPR or various regulations in the US or really internationally. Privacy has become an important aspect. And so at a high level, think of 27701 as a privacy extension to the 27001, 27002 standard and controls that I talked about earlier, which were focused mainly on security, but some privacy. But 27701 focuses and extends it into deep privacy. And it really affects customers that collect and process personal PII or personal information. 27017 is focused on cloud. So 27017 is really focused on cloud implementations and customers that have cloud implementations, which could be either in public clouds or private clouds. The 27017 is also an extension of the ISO 27001. And you cannot really perform 27017 without performing 27001. Then 27018 is really focused on an intersection of public clouds and privacy. So 27018 focuses on not only privacy and PII, but also public clouds. And again, it's an extension to 27001, and you need to be able to do 27001 before you get into one of these extensions. So I talked about a few standards here, and again, we'll be sending a copy of these slides as well as this recording. So you'll have all of this, early next week. Next, let's talk about what is ISMS. So ISMS is really a framework of policies and procedures that include all the different controls involved in an organization's information security or risk management. So the actual framework of policies and procedures that governs the organization is the management system. So what is ISMS? It's really the management system, the list of policies, procedures along legal, physical, technical, and so forth controls that focus on outlining how an organization is managing its risk and information security. So, we gave you a little bit of primer on some of the things you will hear In the ISO 27001 circles, we talked about 27701, 27017, 27018, ISMS. Again, you'll have these slides so you can refresh your memory as and when you run into that. Now we'll do a deep dive into 27001. What is ISO 27001 certification? So I'm going to spend a few minutes here because there are really two things that exist out there. If you are compliant to all the controls and have the right policies and procedures, but have not engaged an external auditor like ControlCase to certify you, at that point, you are ISO 27001 compliant. Again, if you have all the different controls and you meet the framework and have the ISMS, but you have not engaged an external auditor such as ControlCase, then you're ISO 27001 compliant. If you have engaged ControlCase or one of the other certification companies that is allowed to certify companies to ISO 27001 standard, we at ControlCase have ControlCase InfoSec. That's an entity that can certify companies to the ISO 27001 standard. So if you have engaged a third-party auditor, they have actually audited your ISMS or Information Security Management System. Then they give you the seal of certification. That's when you can call yourself ISO 27001 certified. Otherwise, if you have done an internal analysis and have matched all the controls, you can call yourself ISO 27001 compliant, but not really certified. And there's and for a company like ControlCase InfoSec, we have to meet our standards with the various accreditation bodies to ensure we can certify you, i.e. a customer, to the ISO 27001 standard. So we talked about ISO 27001. We talked about ISO 27001 compliance and certification. Next, let's talk about who needs the ISO certification. Who needs ISO 27001 certification? Number one, any organization can choose to get the ISO 27001 certification. In today's world, you'd be hard pressed to find an organization that does not have IT or technology in it or implemented, whether it's cloud or on-premise. And so anybody can choose to do ISO 27001 certification. However, a lot of times ISO 27001 certification done by an external auditor such as ControlCase InfoSec would give you the tools to prove to your customers that you have been audited by an independent body against an international standard and that you are certified and compliant to the standard. So it is also a marketing tool as well as when your customers do due diligence on you, a ISO 27001 certification can help and can actually be a business enabler. What is covered in ISO 27001? For those of you who are from the information security field, all these different domains would look very, very familiar, hopefully. So policies, I'm not going to go through each one. You'll have this list, but you're looking at policies, access controls, business continuity, software development lifecycle, incident management, asset management, HR, which could include background check, physical and environmental security, and all these other domains that many of you are familiar with, perhaps in the context of ISO 27001, but it could also be in the context of other regulations that you might have come across in the past. So that's covered in ISO 27001. Could be things you have already done for other regulations out there as well. Next, let's talk about how many controls are there in ISO 27001. So for those of you who are familiar with the ControlCase methodology, we have mapped all the regulations and filtered them down to what we call as questions. So from a ControlCase perspective, There are a total of 108 questions in our questionnaire that we use as a background to go through the ISO 27001 process. They could be broadly classified into really three areas. And again, not very different than other regulations that may exist out there. Area number one is scoping. Obviously, scoping continues to be an important aspect of what forms your scope for this particular certification. Then you have the actual controls, which is 98 questions, and that could include all the different controls like access control and so forth. And finally, there is a document release questions, which is making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed between your policies, procedures, and our recommendation to certify a company to the ISO 27001. And so there are a total of 108 questions, 108 control case questions that form a part of the ISO 27001 certification and compliance. Next, so we have talked about the questions. What is in the process? So first of all, at the highest level, ISO 27001 is a multi-year certification. It's a 3-year certification with a major certification in year 1 and minor certifications, which is a surveillance audit in years 2 and 3. So typically, year 1, average timeline for getting certified in year 1 is 3 to 6 months, right? 3 is probably the quickest. 6 is more towards the tail end of what companies take, but 3 to 6 months is what the timeline is from soup to nuts. Our process is really a 4-step process. First of all, we do an iterative pre-assessment. So we use the questions we talked about, and we make sure we evaluate the policies, procedures, and iteratively look and educate whether the controls are being met in your organization. So we do an iterative pre-assessment. Then we move to what we call a stage 1 audit. Depending on the organization, it could vary, but I'd say it's on an average of 4 days. It used to be all on-site. In today's world, it could be on-site or remote, but dedicated, and it could be one or multiple auditors. But the ISO stage 1 audit takes, on an average, for a very average site organization, 4 days after the iterative pre-assessment. Once that happens, any gaps can be fixed. Then we move on to ISO stage 2 audit. There has to be a minimum of 10 days between stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2, on an average, is 6 days. Now again, it could be higher, it could be lower, it could be one auditor, it could be multiple. There's an extensive scoping that happens, which determines that, but an average time frame that an organization would have to dedicate would be 6 days for ISO stage 2. Once that's done, and assuming the company is all compliant and has its ISMS in place, we then release the ISO 27001 certificate in our phase 3 after documenting. We also at that point would provide any recommendations for improvement and so forth. So really a 4-step process in year 1. In years 2 and 3, as I talked about earlier, it's really surveillance audits. And so these are not full system audits. These are much smaller audits just to make sure you have kept up with the same practices you had early on in the year 1. And then so year 2 and 3 is really more surveillance audits. So we talked about now the certification process. Next, let's talk about how often do you need ISO 27001. Year 1 is the major audit, and then there are surveillance audits in years 2 and 3. So really think of ISO certification as a 3-year validation with a minor validation or a surveillance audit in year 2 and 3, and the full certification in year 1. After those 3 years get over, the whole 3 years start again, And again, you'll do the full validation and then 2 more surveillance audits. Just a reminder, as we get closer to the end of this webinar, please feel free to put any questions in the questions window. We'll make sure we answer them, the ones that we can today. Any ones we cannot, as I mentioned, we'll make sure we reach out back to you to answer them. So the next section is, especially this would be useful for companies that are going through first-time certification. What are some of the challenges companies face when they want to get ISO 27001 compliant and then certified? These are more general. Number one, a lot of times it'll take people away from their core responsibilities. And as everybody knows, in today's world, people are already doing multiple jobs and are, so it strains already taxed resources. Add to that some other organizational aspect, the time spent on preparing for audits. A lot of organizations need to comply with multiple regulations. Those regulations keep on changing. And it's very seldom that companies know from their auditor clear visibility into where they are in their compliance process. And so sometimes that increases the friction. So there are a lot of general kind of systemic compliance challenges that companies face. And certainly at ControlCase, we work hard through technology and partnership approach to make sure we take these general compliance challenges away to the degree we can. How we do it? Again, the traditional auditor's checklist approach isn't enough, and we follow a partnership approach. Let's talk next about some common challenges to 27001 when it comes to the actual, or 27002, when it comes to the actual controls. There are really 5 areas we have seen companies struggle with. One is business associates. So a lot of times in today's world, you outsource various processes to third-party vendors or business associates. And keeping a handle on that and having a stringent business associate program is key to the ISO 27001, 27002 standard. And that is some areas sometimes companies have to spend some time getting compliant to. Vulnerability management. In today's world, there are lots of types of IT assets. They change all the time, and new vulnerabilities come out all the time. And so that cycle becomes tedious when it comes to keeping up with vulnerabilities. Logging and monitoring is the other area. There is a lot of logs generated. The volumes are large. 24/7 by 365 monitoring is, humanly, it takes a lot of people. You obviously can do a lot of automation, but it still is an area we see companies struggling with at times. Encryption of PII. And then finally, making sure policies, procedures, and trainings all line up. And if you're doing it the first time, sometimes it takes time to get these all in place. So these 5 areas, more so than others, are areas and controls that we have seen companies struggle with, typically the first time when they go through it. So we just wanted to give you guys a list so that you can measure and be prepared maybe more in these areas as you get into your ISO 27001 or 27701 certification process. Finally, why ControlCase? A couple of things I talked about. We have a dashboard where we show you exactly where you stand and what is not compliant. We are certification company, so we certify you against the ISO 27001 standard through our subsidiary ControlCase InfoSec. One audit, we are able to assess you once and show you compliance against multiple standards, some of which you're seeing on the screen. And then finally, we follow a partnership approach to ensure we are not just a checklist auditor. Also, through our ControlCase Compliance Hub, we automate the collection of evidence, including data discovery. We are able to do the remote vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, and we can ensure that the log settings and so forth can be tested to make sure they're compliant with various standards, including ISO 27001 automatically. So really, our Control Case Compliance Hub helps us, in a nutshell, evaluate various controls. Are you doing testing properly? Is your logs configured properly? Are you meeting the standard? Are you searching for sensitive data? Are the systems hardened? All these types of things are performed by Control Case Compliance Hub. At Control Case, we also have what we call continuous compliance services. A lot of times, companies will hire us for certification, but in other cases, they may already have another certification company, and they would hire us in continuous compliance instead of having us for certification. So in a nutshell, why Control Case? Because we follow a partnership approach, we use technology wherever possible, and we make compliance and certification a continuous process instead of a one-time process. Well, thank you for listening to this webinar. Hope you found it useful. I'll go through a few questions now that have been put in the window. I'll have time for a couple of questions. The rest of the questions, we will email it. We will either email or get back in touch with you to make sure we get those questions answered. As we send this out next week, you'll get the copy of the slides, this recording, as well as the compliance checklist and other different items highlighted here. So let's get into Q&A. The first question is, I think it's on 27001 and 27002. And the question is, when you do ISO 27000, that I mentioned that you get certified to the ISO 27001 standard, how does 27002 play into it? That's a good question. So think of 27001 as the standard that defines what all needs to be in place. It defines that you got to have an information security management system. It defines your organizational boundaries. It defines various things that you would expect to see in a standard. So ISO 27001 is the standard, but ISO 27001 does not have the actual controls, right? Because you're talking about information security, you got to evaluate against actual controls as well. So do you have two-factor authentication? Are logs enabled on all your assets? Are you doing 24/7 monitoring? Are all your folks background checked? These are actual controls. These are covered in 27002. 27001 is the standard and the framework against which we certify you as a company to. The 27001 standard relies on 27002 for the controls in place. So they are complementary standards, but the certification is against the 27001 standard. But that was a good question. The next question is, if we are in the cloud environment, in addition to 27001, do we mandatorily need the 27017 standard? That's another good question, and this would be the last one we have time for. The remaining, we'll get back to you with our responses, as well as we'll reach out to you. So when it comes to, if you are in a cloud, you could certainly do only 27001. It is not mandated to do the 27017 extension. You could choose to do the 27017 extension because that actually has kind of a deep dive into the cloud controls. So it is certainly a best practice, and it keeps you up with the latest cloud controls, if you will. But no, it is not mandatory that if you are doing a certification and you are hosted in the cloud or provide a cloud product, that you need to get the 27017. You are perfectly fine just getting the ISO 27001 certification, which continues to be the most popular certification out there. The other ones, other numbers are more recent. But even if you're in the cloud or you provide a cloud product, you are perfectly okay getting just the ISO 27001 certification without any of the extensions, and that will still hold a lot of weight with your business partners as well as your customers. This is all the time we had, folks, today. Thank you for attending. You can view other earlier webinars on our website at www.controlcase.com. We'll send this out next week, and next week this will also make its way to our website. Thank you again for attending the webinar. We look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thank you and have a nice day.